All right, we are here with the Pay Practitioners panel on Friday, November the 15th. We are apparently an hour earlier than normal, but we are excited to be here. Hope that this works for everyone's schedule, but if not, it is going to be recorded, so we'll be excited to check the recordings afterward. Today, we are excited to talk about job architecture. We ran a poll, and that was the overwhelming request from folks, compensation practitioners, to see what do we think about job architecture? What are some best practices? What are some trends that are happening? And how should you, as a compensation practitioner, think about job architecture, and how can you deploy that with your organization? So as we kick this off, I'm curious, who's worked on a job architecture project most recently? When was the last project? Has anyone, Denise? Yeah? Paul?
I mean,
Okay.
So all the time.
They are.
I was going to say that's all the time. We're built in those.
Well, great. Well, so as we think about job architecture, I think it's probably a good idea to start with, what does a job architecture project mean? What should companies get out of it? And I'd like to just kick it off, and can I ask Denise? Denise, what does a job architecture project mean to you? And what do you hope that your clients, or what are the clients hoping to gain from a job architecture project?
So I'll speak to, it depends on the client, right? Sometimes they'll have job families already in place. That's usually one component of it. Sometimes they'll already have pay structures, but what they want is career paths built, and more kind of a proactive approach to developing career ladders so that they can communicate those possibilities to employees for growth. It's often building the foundation that helps them do pay equity audits, right? How do you group substantially similar jobs, but in other ways besides by pay grade or career level, job level? So it kind of depends on the client, but fundamentally, it's usually job families, career levels, pay grades, market pricing or point factor methodology, and then developing based on your compensation strategy and philosophy, developing the communication tools to talk about it with your employees and managers.
So it sounds like a pretty quick project.
It depends. Sounds easy, hard in practice, right? Like people on this panel know it sounds easy in practice, but once you start digging in and looking at what's in place today, sometimes it's fairly clean and sometimes it's just a mess and it's chaos and people aren't on the right job titles and there's no governance and standards that are being followed. There's a lot of exceptions and it becomes more of a cleanup exercise. So it really depends on the client and what they have in place today.
And what kind of what are some of the bigger, do we think that those job architecture projects are becoming more prevalent today, or have they really kind of always been something that companies have been doing, or are they becoming more popular? I see, Paul, you're nodding. So it sounds like they're.
But Paul's got an opinion.
I do. I always have an opinion, Denise.
Yes, I love that.
I do think they're becoming more prevalent, and the question is why, right? And my personal belief is that with pay transparency has come an emphasis on sort of structures of pay, and those don't communicate well unless you've got clarity about your job architecture, right? Yep. You tell me I'm a grade 11, whatever the heck that means, and that this is my salary range. The next thing I want to know is, what does it take to be a grade 12 or a grade 13? Right. And that requires the language and the consistency that a cleaner job architecture brings. So we talk a lot about, you have to in this era of pay transparency, location differences in work, and just the need to do comp with like one person on your team, you have to revisit the whole foundation. What's your philosophy? What's the job architecture? What's your pay structure? And how do you operate it? So it's a really critical link in the middle of that string, which is why I think the past couple of years have been an uptick in organizations rethinking how this works.
Yeah.
I used to see it just in larger organizations, mid to large organizations. Now I see it, and I see that ask from smaller organizations of even less than 100 employees. So it's definitely more prevalent.
Yeah, I would also add like one additional driver that I've been seeing is just the greater use of technology and AI and trying to get the ROI on the Workday, the Oracle, the other systems out there that are only so good based on the data that's in there. And so part of that tech transformation for a lot of companies is also that job architecture. So agree with you full-heartedly around pay transparency being a driver as well. And I think to Denise's point around those smaller organizations planning to scale and have the right governance from the beginning, pay transparency is probably the main driver. I think for some of these larger organizations, like we just did 100,000 employee one, it's part of a Workday implementation, and they want to make sure that what's going into the system, they're testing it right, the controls are in place, and they're actually going to get the ROI because, it's a big ticket item.
It is.
Yeah.
Well,
I think,
and
the
ahead,
other
Carrie.
thing that we're finding with some of our clients, can you guys hear me okay? I think last time I was on, it was kind of weird, but okay. Thank you for validating that. So I think one of the things that we're finding is that clients are coming to us because of pay transparency, and we're going in and seeing that misalignment of titles and really taking it one step further into that communication, engaging the leaders and really helping them understand that job architecture is all about the job. And if they've been in a situation where they have pay grades that are aligned by job, so grade-based pay versus maybe pay levels, which are aligned to the market, they're confused when we go through that validation of the job hierarchy on thinking, okay, well, I have to make this job up here because that's the pay I need for that job. Whereas level setting really that work and saying, let's talk about the pay later and just talk about that job. And then we can decide how the pay is going to align once you get that job ready. So I'm finding really more engaging with the leaders than the HR people as we go through validating that hierarchy and helping bring them along so they can talk to their employees about that. So
Justin, what we're finding is because we work with a lot of small to medium-sized organizations, and because title inflation is occurring very badly, people are giving away titles like crazy, is that we're letting the market benchmarking kind of drive the job architecture to some degree, if you will. So driving how many levels we have in job families, that sort of thing. Because as we all know, you can have two managers, right? You could have an accounting manager and an IT manager. Job requirements for education experience might be the same, scope might look the same, but they're going to benchmark very differently in the market. And so we're just finding with small to medium-sized businesses using the market benchmarking to some degree to determine the levels within job families is working well for them.
So that's the common approach I take as well. So I think the job architecture, you kind of got two ends of a spectrum. On one end of it, you've got, let's sit down with everyone and talk about all your jobs and all your levels and then build it from the ground up. So I kind of think that's a traditional job architecture. And then later on, you figure out how to group them together. And later on, you figure out corresponding levels. And later on, you figure out different data sources in the market, which might be one or might be several for different countries. But with small and medium, particularly North American and particularly tech companies, which is what I work with a lot, once you've gone through that matching process to like a Mercer or a Towers or a Radford, all those survey providers have their own hardwired job architecture. When you go through that process, it's called whole job classification. And the reason is because you've got this catalog of jobs and levels, which is deliberately built to approximately reflect jobs in a typical marketplace, which means that somewhere in there is a pretty close job architecture for a lot of companies that operate in the same space. So I kind of think of it like a sculpture. So you start with this big block, which might be a job catalog, but once you go through that matching process, like you mentioned, Sandra, and you focus on the job and not the person, and you say, well, let's find what jobs we need, not what people are doing. Job, not the person. Then you end up with a list of matches and families, and then you can kind of carve away everything you don't need. And what's left is a pretty good starting point for a lot of companies. So if anyone out there is thinking about, okay, what do we need to do a job architecture? Well, at least match into a survey provider as a starting point. That'll give you something, and that will help you with some of that pay transparency stuff, because you'll have some degree of uniqueness And if you think about a basic definition of job architecture, all it is really a systematic way of categorizing jobs. That's pretty much all it is. So, that gives you the foundation to do that pay equity work as well.
That's a good call out, just starting with a salary survey, because a lot of them do have really good tools built within their published results that you can utilize.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the common things that we hear from either people that we're talking to about implementing a product like CompTool or an HRIS or any kind of HR software is we're doing a job architecture project right now, so we're going to need to wait until that's finished. But what we've actually found is that there's actually a lot of benefit to using tools like CompTool or other benchmarking tools or other salary survey management platforms, because the reporting and the tools help you identify those jobs that may have overlapping responsibilities or have overlapping surveys that are being used. One of the nice things that I have seen in the past is, working with different companies to build out the entire family at first. I think there was a comment about, how many levels do we have in that? So I actually stopped taking one-off job reviews halfway through my career and said, if you're going to build one job, let's build that whole family now, whether it's a P1 through P4 up to a P6, whatever it was, because there were a number of good things that came out of that. A, it helped the manager think through the progression of those roles. And B, it helped them to stop creating those single one-off jobs that they needed to have filled for a specific person versus the role. So it really kind of helped to help them think more holistically about that entire job family and their career progression. And I think that's been one of the nice things that we've seen companies start to do. And it's also nice because it's like, if you want to build one job, that's easy, but do you really need it? Let's build a couple more jobs because it's a little bit less work, but it's a little bit more work, but you get a lot more value out of it. So it makes the manager just a little more intentional with the jobs they create.
I had that conversation with a client just this week where we were proposing that as a concept. Like, no, don't just build the levels you have, build the full lens, right? And their feedback, which I found both surprising but instructive, which was, but then we're going to have too many jobs, right? Like there was this view that the number of job codes or job profiles, pick your terminology, that creates was going to be inflated then, which is true, right? So if you only have one person in your compensation job family, and I've now created 6 different levels for that, I have more job codes than I do people. But we had a good debate about what's the cost of one more job code? 0. As long as you've got a good way of knowing what's used, what's not, right? Like you have to have some enablement to make sure that it doesn't become overwhelming, but it's way more efficient to go ahead and create it. You can be consistent. Yeah. They're ready for the future at that point. But it was this not weird. It was a discussion about but that's one more job code that I don't need, and
I've had pushback like that too. And I had one person say, if you build it, they will come. They'll expect the promotion if you see it in the job table. I'm like, okay, time out. You got to have standards. You don't get the higher job unless the business needs the higher level work to be done. So you can't just open up Pandora's box and build everything and then have everybody clamoring for the next highest level without some standard. I
love how many references I hear in day-to-day life to Field of Dreams and how many parallels there are in the workspace. And from a film about a guy that made a baseball pitch in his backyard for ghosts or something, it's pretty amazing.
I think job architecture gets a bad rep as well around just the number of job codes inherently means you didn't have good hygiene or good governance around it. It doesn't mean you built it with a purpose and you have the extra ones to help that one person in comp have a career path here and understand what that looks like. Or maybe someday they're going to get a direct report, budget willing, and you want to have that already in place. But I agree. I hear too many clients say, we have 15,000 job codes. We need to get down to 5,000. Why is 5,000 the magic number? It sounds great. So, there are some of those preconceived notions. So I do think separating the governance, the hygiene versus the number of job codes is really important.
Yeah.
So a great analogy that I was told, I wish I coined it, but I did not. This is someone else. Is that it's like building a house when you build job architecture. So You could argue that, like, you can extend the metaphor and say, well, the number of floors are the levels, and then the number of rooms is the number of families, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're going to build a house, you're not going to be in every room at the same time. You're going to build a house for the future. You're going to have more people into the house. And so once you build the house, you know the rooms in the house, that's the foundation. Then you figure out where the people go into those rooms. And not every room is going to be occupied at every time, but you kind of need a room available because someone might be there at some point in the future. So the house analogy I find comes up to scrutiny pretty well.
It's a great example.
James, it's kind of like defining your titles, right? I find, especially with small to medium-sized organizations, they don't have any titling guidelines.
Right.
And then they wonder how they have 200 job titles for 70 people, right? It's like you got to have some titling guidelines.
Yep.
I had one client that was half VPs or above. It's it's impressive how quickly title inflation can get out of hand.
Yeah.
But there is
That's
the
awful
business
hard
card
on the road.
title as well. Like that allows you to be accretive in the marketplace because no one will take a meeting with you if you're not a VP. And so everyone is a VP or an MD or, you know, an Esquire, even if they don't have a law degree, just to get the meetings. And so I do see a lot of battling as well with clients around, we can't take away their titles. They'll quit. They won't be able to get meetings, etc. And what I view as being more and more common is having those two job titles. One is the external job title. It's the business card title, LinkedIn title. And then the other one that HR can actually use internally in the system to manage the right access, learning and development, career paths, comp, etc., which tends to work pretty well.
Yeah,
It does, as long as you talk to the employee about what real is and that everybody knows what real is, right? Because, you know, you get those two employees side by side. One has that very lofty outside title, and, you know, they're just like, well, why do they make more money? Assuming they do because their outside title is higher, right? And so it's really gets into that communication and change and saying, hey, this isn't the same world we were in 3-5 years ago.
Yeah,
this is a different world.
We're big proponents of your levels, your titles, and your comp structure none of those are identical. They are all highly correlated but distinct because you want to have some flexibility to decide your titling strategy. You know, some countries, some words are just off limits and you want to be careful about that. Or there is some legitimacy to function specific nomenclature that nobody else wants to use, but makes perfect sense, you know, within a given area. So allowing some flexibility on title, I think is a feature, not a bug in a good job architecture. But I agree with you 100%, Sherry. You don't want it to replace the clarity of level. You need to have both and have a good way of talking about when are they the same, why are they the same, and when are they different and why.
Yeah, I mean, globally, sometimes you can't even get a meeting with someone. You know, we're working with a nonprofit. You can't even get a meeting with someone without having the right title.
Yeah.
And, you know, that used to be fine. So I'd say like 5 or 7 years ago. So we would just say, okay, this is your title outside. Well, now those government agencies are actually checking internally to ensure that that is the real title, not just the business card title. So, you know, we're all evolving and understanding the tricks of the trade, I guess. So trying to, you know, sort all of that out is a everyday challenge, never a dull time.
And I think it's interesting too, because I have seen a number of companies where you have a job posting. That job posting is not the system's title. That is specific to the position, because if I were to hire a software engineer 3, that could be all kinds of things when I need a very specific kind of engineer. But I think it creates that challenge when the candidate comes on, has their offer letter for sys eng III. Like, what is this? But and it's funny because, I mean, we can oftentimes think, oh, titles, they shouldn't matter, but I really think they do. And when you look at that global perspective, it's very important in some places. And I think this is also one of the questions I have for the group is when we think about global job tables, I'm curious, right? Has anyone built one? Has anyone steered companies away from them? Pro, con, what do you think about global job tables?
I like them, but it takes a lot of stakeholder work to negotiate the leveling and the terminology, and it takes a lot of empathy and listening skills to respond to so many different, if you've got 3 countries, that's different than 30, right? So it takes time and effort.
You learn how to count to 10 in lots of different languages. Like, okay. Right? So, yeah, it is challenging, especially when some of the cultural practices for like promotions are different in, say, APAC than they may be in the United States, right? They need to have that additional structure. So pulling it all together is right. Stakeholder management.
Yeah.
I think
And
that's,
just making sure everybody's aware.
yeah. I guess a question for the panel, just curious, to that point with Sherry, has anyone ever done a job architecture project where a stakeholder hasn't said, well, this person should be promoted as part of this process? Because I
Oh.
feel like promotions always get embedded as you're trying to get through the job architecture rollout.
Right.
What you're doing.
And that's after we just lowered the job 2 levels, right? Because it was out of whack.
Well, I've
So
seen
it's
job architecture
interesting.
projects not get implemented because it comes to the people impacts, and they'll see who needs to go down levels. And I've seen large companies go, nope, we're not doing it because the C-suite, et cetera, could not have those conversations. So it's stakeholder work is key in these projects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does become a huge barrier. And, the tactician in me always thinks like it's always wrong. Like, and I don't want to throw my own work under the bus, but like at any given point, there is somebody who's not at the right level, right? Because if they're ready to be promoted, I could argue it's wrong today. As soon as they got promoted, are they really at that level, right? There's always going to be some misalignment. That kid who's rising rapidly is never at the right level because they're just learning and growing. So like getting people comfortable with imperfection is really important in some of this stuff. And I get it doesn't feel fair. Like I had a passionate debate with one leader about like, but that's not fair. I'm like, yeah, like I hear that from my 5-year-old all the time. And I'm like, sorry, like life isn't fair. And you want to do our best. And I don't mean it to say minimize that there's disruption, but like we need to get people comfortable with, yes, it may not be perfect today. Now you know what your priority is when the time is right to promote. Same with, grandfather. Does anybody ever reduce the title? Yes. Do they do it a lot? No. Right. More often than not, you grandfather it and you have to accept it. Right. That's another imperfection just on the other side. Right. So it's like you have to recognize it's going to be a little messy at times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair is a word. I had one leader teach me. She's like, don't use the word fair. Fair is a place you take your pig to be judged. It's not a word you use when it comes to pay. Stop using the word fair. It's very personal perception. Stop. Say equitable, say competitive, but don't use the word fair. I do think you can influence people's perception of fair. And I think I worked with somebody who used to be in the FBI, and he said, people will accept things if you say, here's how we made the decision. I know you don't like the end result and the outcome because it impacted you in this way, but we consistently applied these principles and these guidelines across the population, and this is where it landed. And if you want to get back to X where you were, here's what you need to do about it. People can argue with you all day and not like outcomes, but at some point you just have to draw a line in the sand and implement in a way as consistently as you can to get to fair.
Well, and I think it's interesting if you really take the work and do the good job infrastructure, that next reorganization that comes out, now you have a template, because inevitably every reorganization, a handful of people are getting promoted, whether the job is greater or not, right? It's just different. But if you can pull out that architecture and say, okay, so these are the jobs you need. This is where they're going to lie. And no, they're not getting promoted. It's a lateral move. We'll give them a different title, not a greater title, but an equal title, right size it.
Hey, Justin, something else that we see, and I think anybody watching this would appreciate everyone's experience here, is what do you do when they want more levels than you can find benchmarking data for? And how do you handle that? This comes up all the time, right?
So that comes up all the time, and then at the same time, there'll be some other client telling me there's too many levels and they need to consolidate them. So, like, the question was, what problem are you trying to solve for when you're asking for more levels? Because normally it comes down, you want more career opportunities. It's like, okay, well, that's not going to fix it then, because all you're doing is just creating fake career steps where there weren't any before. They're not meaningful. So I always say, like, if you want a new level, you've got to be able to define it. Like, you can easily create data. You can just interpolate the data. It's pretty easy to figure that kind of stuff out. But if you want to create a level, then you're implying it means something to have that level. So a good example is like an associate director, somewhere between a senior manager and a director, right? And in some industries, like life science industries, they use it quite a lot, actually. It does come up quite a lot, but it does mean something. It is actually a fairly well-defined set of responsibilities, so it makes sense to add in. But if all you're doing is trying to give someone an extra title because they're upset about the fact they haven't been promoted in the last year and they can't make it as a director yet, that's not going to solve that problem. You might keep them quiet for a conversation, then they're going to turn around and say, well, actually, I'm just doing the same job with a different name. So my question is always, what problem are you trying to solve? And if it's career opportunities, then there's a good chance that adding that extra level is probably not going to help you very much.
Yeah, Cassandra, I do push back pretty frequently, though, on the benchmarking surveys numbers of levels probably isn't the right benchmark, though, either, right? So just to name one that rhymes with Adford, like the S1 level is really not appropriate for all the different kinds of like support, paraprofessional, manual work, if you will, that might exist, right? There are other platforms, one in particular that has just 3 letters in it that does a better job, in my opinion, of like, there's really different levels of work in that like starting level. So you smash them together and guess what? You get more levels than any one of them has. So I do think start with the work and how does it progress? We're okay if these 2 levels benchmark to the same thing. Maybe you interpret a different market position. Maybe you just make a gut call and we want to pay that person or that role more, right? Like we don't think you want to be too wedded to like a survey's methodology. It's okay to benchmark 2 different roles to the same level in a survey and interpret accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good point. There's also that distinction you have to teach people. What's the difference between a job and a job level? And what's proficiency in a job? You're just getting better at a particular job. And I always go back to what we've said before is what's the work? Write the job description. Tell me what's different in the work and let's compare the 2. Is it truly a difference in job responsibilities, significant enough to justify a new job and that higher expense for the organization? Or is it just proficiency in the same job and you pay higher in the pay range? So I think there's that distinction you have to make frequently as well in these projects.
That's so true. That's what we always push back on. Can you really define a difference in the job?
Yep.
And is it significant, enough to warrant another level?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the hard ones, right? Oh, sorry, Paul.
Go ahead.
Just a quick one. I think one of the hard things is then that when they're working with a leader is working with an HR person, they're saying, oh, that's a promotion. And the HR person is like, okay.
Yeah.
I have a manufacturing client where it's really important that their trainee roles are sort of cleanly segmented from the one that can actually work independently, right? It's not benchmarked any different. It's really not that different of a level, right? But it's really important that they know this person needs supervision, right? Different kinds of supervision and sort of quality checks. So great, it's now a new level. Like the cost of adding that level is 0, again, just like adding one more job code. And it was really important for how their systems integrate, how they talk about sort of progression to do such. Okay, fine, right? Like, but because there's a notable difference in the work when somebody's in their first 3 months doing that thing in that company, right? So the work was clear, create a new level, move on.
So it's the ice cream analogy, ice cream cone, right? So if you have an ice cream cone with 1 scoop, is that really a 2-scoop ice cream cone, or is it just chocolate that you've changed from vanilla or strawberry from pineapple, right? How significant is it? How many different scoops have you added onto your ice cream cone to make it a difference? And I think there has to be a lot of training to vet those job descriptions, to really say, it looks different to me rather than more. right? You just walked across the hall. You didn't go up 2 flights of stairs.
I'm just trying to think if I ever had pineapple ice cream.
I know,
It's amazing,
right?
I was thinking that too.
Maybe
I
it's
feel like if you-
Neapolitan, right?
If you turn this into an ice cream discussion, everyone's going to want even more levels. No one's going to be complaining about too many levels
Too
anymore.
much ice cream.
Nobody wants a small cup.
Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, then what's the sprinkles? The sprinkles are you sprinkled strategic throughout the job description and now it's a VP. That's not right. Like,
Right. Yeah.
no.
Do we have 30 more minutes of this analogy coming? What's the cherry on top?
If we're actually going to torture an analogy, I want to call out how Denise and I must lead very different lives when, like, taking the pig to be judged is part of how she even thinks about the world. Because I've never owned a pig, let alone thought about it being judged.
I grew up in Kansas on a farm that's been in my family for generations. I've been to the fair and had animals judged, so I get it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
Didn't let that go.
So I want to ask a question. If so, when we get into building the job architecture and you're working with a client, how often are they struggling with? Here's another farm analogy: the chicken or the egg. What comes first, the job description or the job architecture? Which really is more powerful? And it may depend. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Job description every time. What's the work? I always go back as that's the foundation of
I
anything.
agree. As long as it's a good job description.
Say that again.
As long as it's a good
Ah.
job description.
Yes.
Ah.
If it's a good job description, then yeah, I think that's the starting point, right? It should work.
So if that's the case, then so we have job descriptions, right? And we love job descriptions, but how often do you build hierarchies that have job descriptions? All of the jobs.
Well, I think that, like Justin said, you know, he got to the point when he was in house where he wouldn't accept just one job and he'd ask him to build the hierarchy of jobs. I think that's a shift, and it's a tremendous example of how you go from being a tactical comp person to being more strategic and providing guidance and stepping from short-term thinking to longer-term thinking and business impact and career growth and talent development and integrating the two. So I think it, you know, depends on where you want to play. Do you want to just play in the space of what do you need today, or do you want to play in that space of what are you going to need tomorrow to support growth?
Okay,
Right.
one more thing on that then. So the
Okay.
job descriptions, right? Job descriptions are important, right? So we know the work. Who loves making job descriptions? So again, nobody. So we don't have them. So we have to start somewhere.
That's why it's the first thing to be outsourced to AI and machine learning.
Exactly. How many of you have used AI to write a job description lately? Raise your hand, right?
Yeah.
Like I use it, you know, to help me create distinctions between jobs, at least as a starting point, instead of a blank page for my clients to look at. I do think I'm old enough. This is dating me horrendously. There used to be a job in compensation profession that was job analyst before you ever became a comp analyst. And I was a job analyst when I first started back in the 90s. And you were basically maintaining the job table and writing job descriptions. I think one of the reasons I write so well and I'm good at describing distinctions in jobs is I've written thousands of those darn things over the years. Not something I like to do today, but something I have done, right? So I always go back to what's the job. But to your point, Terry, I do think you can build job architecture levels and things like that to provide a framework for people to see what's possible. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts and outcomes of these job architecture projects is possibility.
Yeah. I always believe
Your interview bot to create job descriptions off of level criteria, right? So it's because nobody likes to do it and everybody's terrible at the first draft.
Yep.
So tell us what you think it is. Give me a title, you know, a couple of responsibilities, let the robot draft out the description that sort of conforms to your level language and then let them change it, right? But it gives them a 90% answer, you know, and if they don't give you certain things, it was pretty good at like clarifying questions like, well, this feels similar to this one, you know, is it the same or not, right? It was good at that. So like, I agree with you, Bobby. Like this is where AI is making the job analyst job disappear because it can do basically good enough work.
Sherry, my experience in a large organization was we started with the job architecture. And we, actually defined what the different roles were going to be. And then, I mean, this was like a large HR department. So, we had to start with, okay, one of the levels is HR consultant, right? And there was like a summary job profile, if you will, very high level. But then we had detailed job descriptions for compensation, for recruitment, for training, et cetera. Because each of the skill sets for a consultant in the different disciplines was different and would also benchmark differently. So I've seen them started with job architecture in large organizations, and then the job documentation follows that.
Yep,
Yeah.
that works too.
Yeah, and I actually, my thought was that we always started with the job leveling and kind of the career framework, because for us, that kind of established the skeleton. And then we could use the job descriptions to really start to put the muscle on and fill things in. And a lot of times too, like kind of to Paul's earlier point, right? Like writing a job description people don't do it very well the first time. But when you've got that feedback around, here's what a level 1 is, a level 2, level 3, and you can use that to kind of level set what the job description should look like, it really helped to create more thoughtful and better organized and consistent job descriptions. I mean, so CompTool, actually, we have a job description writing tool that uses the levels as the starting point to write descriptions that are aligned to the internal levels. And I think it's similar to, I believe it's that 3-letter survey provider, right? They've got the description of the job family, and they have independent leveling descriptions within.
Yep.
I just know if I had to wait for all the job descriptions to be built,
Yeah, I get
I
started.
wouldn't have any clients.
Right.
So there you go. I mean, it's just a lot of work, but I think they have to think of them in concert together, as you need both.
Well, and gone are the days where I can still remember, this is again dating me, I can still remember the days where you go sit next to the employee and you'd watch them work for a period of time.
Desk audits.
Right? Desk audits, where you'd write the job description and ask questions as they're doing their job, and then come back or have them fill out a lengthy questionnaire of what they've done. I think the speed of business and technology has certainly sped that up to a point where we don't do that anymore, but you still have to have that important validation step by the people doing the work or the manager overseeing it.
We haven't got an audience, so I'm going to ask a question from the audience. I'm not with the audience. So when we think about leveling guides, right? So again, typical North America, then there's different ways to think about it. But if I assume it's a kind of North American approach, you've got these families, and within that, you've got these career levels, P1 through 6, M1 through 6, whatever. One of the things, and Cassandra as well, you might have some thoughts on this, but we've worked with similarly sized companies, but once you have that architecture, you tend to have like some kind of organizational standard for what those levels mean, right? And we think of these standard survey sources and for pretty good starting points. But at some point, the question is, well, can we have something specific to the family, to this family or that family, this family? And of course, if you multiply that by the number of families you've created, that's a lot of work to write it. You can get AI's help with some of this stuff these days, it makes it a lot quicker, but it's still work to do that. So I guess my question is, like, if you're in a job architecture process and you're thinking about writing these family-specific leveling guides, when's the right time to do it? Is there a critical mass? Like, is it worth doing it at all if the company is going to change a lot? Like, what's your advice on this one?
Oh boy, we find it size dependent, James. And we also find it also is dependent on how complex the client wants something to be or not be. I think that's why a lot of the size clients we're working with like us to build the job families, and then how many levels is each job family going to have based on what we're seeing for their jobs and benchmarking. And if there's gaps, then building for the gaps, right, for the future. I don't think there's a magical number, I'm going to say, but you definitely have to have enough jobs to kind of make it worthwhile. You know what I'm saying as well. So we find that the type of organizations we work with, rather than doing job families more like at a department level, like you would for a large organization, I'm sure you see this too. You know, it's more like, here's our staff jobs. here's our professional technical jobs, here's our management jobs. They're ready for that level, but they're not ready for the level where, you're starting, accounting at, the beginning, job architecture, and you're building, 10 different jobs, and they're not ready for that.
Right.
And so for them, we find something that simplicity is what they're looking for. It still gives them natural career pathing, right? And actually, to some degree, it gives them a little bit better career pathing because they can see, I can go from these jobs here to, all these different jobs here. So it's not just about, I'm in compensation and I can go from here to here. I'm in compensation and I might be able to go to accounting, or I might be able to go, somewhere else.
I find and when they're broader like that, I like that approach as well. My caveat is usually, but you need to make sure the managers then know how to use it effectively. There's less explicit at that point, right? There's you're not talking about the coding language or the accounting standards that need to be understood, or anything like that. It needs to be interpreted by a manager. Manager needs to understand, need to interpret those levels and apply them to the discipline of the direct report.
Well, and the real challenge becomes when they have their titles wrong, right? You're calling somebody a senior accountant, but they're basically processing AP and AR. And they don't understand why their job is not 2 levels up, where the other people called senior accountants are, right? And they're down here.
And then you have an FLSA problem usually too, because they happen to be, eligible for overtime while all the other senior accountants aren't. And it's like, why are we being inconsistent? It's because they're doing different jobs.
Yeah.
And I know I
Or
missed
they
that
don't
point.
give them overtime because they're a senior accountant.
To Paul's point, there's always somebody misleveled. There's always somebody with the wrong FLSA. Like there's always something not quite right. We got job security for a while.
Yeah.
But it's creating a lot of problems for organizations, because now that we do have pay transparency and now there is a lot of information out there, right? They're getting a ton of pushback from employees. Well, my title's, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not, being paid what the market. I mean, I just counseled, with a client this week on this, similar scenario. It's like, well,
and I think it goes back to our last panel. It all is interconnected, like around the performance management process, and managers being equipped to have those difficult conversations around why you're placed in the range where you are and what is your actual level, etc. So starting to see a trend with these topics that you picked, Justin. They all come back to the same point.
Well, and I'm curious too. I mean, I think, part of that point is communication and making sure that people are educated and understand. How much of the job architecture project should we share with employees? And is that different than managers? And is that different than HR partners? Because I have had conversations with many different teams, especially departmental teams, where they, one of my favorites is talking through a team of 37. They came back with 45 job descriptions. And, I don't want to say that that's the wrong number. But when you asked them, why do you have this many different job descriptions? It was to ensure that career pathing was effective, but also that we were recognizing the specific, unique parts about those different jobs. Channel marketing, brand marketing, email marketing, other marketing, whatever it might have been. But then if their real goal was just making sure that they had true career pathing and they were comping everyone appropriately, when we actually looked at the different rates of pay across all those different types of marketing, there wasn't a heck of a lot of difference between an email marketing specialist and a brand marketing specialist and a digital marketing specialist. Some, yes, but most of the time, no. So we could leverage, singular or, one kind of job, survey job, and leverage that's more broad and say, now you can create more broad job descriptions to allow folks to, move over to this role without having to change their roles, their titles, things like that. It made a lot of an easier process to manage, but also had a benefit to employees and managers to be able to let them do more broad work rather than focus on one specific thing.
That's
position descriptions, right? Positions descriptions versus job descriptions,
or job descriptions that read like standard operating procedures, and that is an actual job description, right? Like a lot of this comes back to just education. I think with pay transparency and the scrutiny that employers are feeling from employees now, there's, at least what I see in some organizations, is this major resistance to, well, we shouldn't have to explain ourselves. Well, these laws are put in place to force you to explain yourself and have it make sense. So hiding behind the screen, like in Wizard of Oz, bringing up the Kansas reference again, that you can't do that anymore, right? So I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to educate. I know I sit on the other side of the fence. I don't just work with employers, I do pay negotiation coaching. And so I spend a fair bit of time with people who think that sometimes they are underpaid, just educating and saying, you know what, here's what the data says, you're actually not. And here's typically the framework about how employers think about placing you in the range and how you've described your performance and what you've shown me in terms of performance documentation. It looks to me like you're paid correctly. You can ask for more, but you got to have a value story that's much bigger in order to influence the decision maker. So, you know, it's education is key. If you don't have somebody kind of focused on the education and training and comms piece, you're going to struggle in this work.
And is that the manager? Oops, sorry, James. Go ahead.
I think HR and comp people should enable managers, but we shouldn't necessarily. I think we can give presentations and we can give high level feedback, and we can give managers tools and resources and role play with them. But ultimately, managers should manage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so one of the things I've really enjoyed working on is the manager training things and developing the materials and coaching. And I do like FAQs. I think they're fun to come up with, fun to write. One of my favorite FAQs is an employee that would ask, I think I should be in a more senior role and doing these duties. Why aren't I paid more? Why aren't I paid like this person? I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah.
I always think that responses, I've created variations of these responses, but there's two things that need to happen. The employee needs to demonstrate the capability, but the business needs to need the person to be in that job as well. Like, yeah, you might be able to be the CEO, but we probably don't need you to be the CEO. We've got a CEO right now. So the higher up you go, the fewer and further those opportunities become, right? So there can only be one CEO, but you can have plenty of accounting analysts in a big company. So those two things like form the basis of a lot of those responses. Like, yeah, okay, well, first of all, let's demonstrate that you can do this stuff. Yeah, that's one thing. But then we've got to make a business case for putting someone else into that role. Because if you leave this role, someone's got to do the thing that you were doing before that as well, despite your capabilities. Yeah. So I find that like opens up and frees up the conversation a bit. And that initial awkward, difficult question that no one wants to have becomes something a lot more positive and explorative and potentially create some great career opportunities for people.
Usually people come in with a, what about me? Why am I not getting something? And if you can take their me and turn it into we, and think more broadly about not just you, but everybody else in the organization and the organization itself, and what are their needs and requirements to be sustainable over the long term, then you can, some people can't step out of the me box. So
yeah, but as an employee, and I'm sure you can do that as well. If you can make the case that the business needs someone to do the job that you want, and if you can make the case that someone's ready to step into your shoes in the role that you vacate, then you can make the whole case yourself. And no one's FAQs is like no one's going to care about your career more than you do. So like, don't sit around waiting for other people to create opportunities for you. I mean, you can do if you want, but someone else is going to slip in while you're waiting.
Wait for yourself, but also read the room, right? There's an emotional intelligence quotient to this too, that you got to pick your timing and say it in the right way.
Right.
Seems like you work for a big consulting firm, James. I've heard that line a lot.
But I'm curious too. We're talking about what to share and how to set expectations. Is there anything that you guys would share with managers but not employees when it comes to a job architecture project? I mean, I think that I have found a lot of times employees just want to know how things are done, and they want to ensure and feel confident that it's done fairly. Well, I guess I should use the word equitably, but they want to make sure that it's done equitably and with them in mind.
Yeah.
What would you not share with employees that you would share with managers?
I don't know if it's a not or will. Some of this is a philosophy around how transparent you want to be. I absolutely have clients that are pretty quiet about levels, but open about pay ranges because they're not the same thing. And the employee cares more about the pay range than the level, but there's problems with that. I think one thing, and we just published an article in World at Work, shout out to World at Work, about like one of the friction points we see with communicating is the career stream concept. So if you are going to use your comp survey providers, job architecture as a starting point, like the management versus professional versus whatever you want to call the thing that's not professional, support, paraprofessional, whatever, that does not communicate well to employees. Right? What do you mean I'm not in management? I have a direct report. Well, you only have one direct report, not the two that we require. Well, I have my intern. Doesn't that count? Or like counterproductive things happen very quickly when you over communicate how you benchmark the job versus how you want to talk about the work. And some orgs still do want to communicate like career streams, that there's value in it. I'm not saying never do it, but the words don't work well, right? So it's a super like tactical thing. But to go and tell somebody, oh, no, you're not professional, you're support, that's not a winning argument. It doesn't work. Particularly BDR, right? In sales. Radford happens to call that an S4 job, not a P1. And that's super controversial, right? So like you keep sharing. So just be thoughtful about what are they supposed to take from the fact that I'm being called support instead of professional? Probably doesn't add a whole lot of value. I understand management. There's some reasoning to say like, no, we do think about this differently, and you primarily add value through your sort of people orientation, not your task orientation. Great, then go there. But the labels can be very alarming to people.
They can be very triggering. That's a really good point.
Yeah. I mean, when we talk with our leaders now, we talk generally about, the individual contributor versus the leader of people, not breaking it out any finer than that, because we also find globally, when we think about in the US, very US centric, that non-exempt work is usually falling in that S support area, right? Globally, that doesn't work. They're all professionals. Right? So just mush them together and then have a conversation about that individual contributor. And that 1-over-1 is always an interesting conversation. Like, I'm a manager, I have one person. And I said, well, if it takes you over 70% of the time to just manage that one person, I think we have another problem. Right? So why does that person take so long to manage? What's going on? Letting them know that, over and over, I still hear about we need an individual contributor path. Well, it's always been there. You just need to advertise that there really are individual contributor jobs where you can advance and make money. You don't have to switch over to management to have it happen, right? It just always alarms me when people say, oh, we need more individual contributor paths. They've been there. Well, I've been doing this a while, so a long time.
But you also have to frame that, right? But the business needs the work to be done, right? Like the higher you go up in an organization, the less people you need at those higher levels. And that's the same in the individual contributor path. I know I've worked with some who I want an individual contributor, akin to a director. I'm like, these are like people I would expect to have patents and really amazing, inventive things. Do we have work and people that function at that level? And when you start bringing some outside perspective in, I think that's where you can have some really great dialogue.
Yeah. I mean, that whole committee, once you get to those top principal levels of work, really needs to be thoughtful so that you don't lower the bar of who has access there, because you're just watering down then the contributions of that level. So
I think those are easier than the M3P4 debate, right? That's where I find, what is the difference? What is the difference? Somebody really explain, other than, well, the survey says you have to have direct reports. But I find in a modern workplace, the people on your org chart have a very low correlation to your leadership of the business. Matrix structures are all over the place. I have one client who is the head of compensation with no direct reports because they've chosen to decentralize compensation.
Sure.
Right? They have a team of 30 when you actually look at what they lead. So it's you have to be careful about, these sort of binary, you're M or P is I think the higher levels, the governance of that usually works out if people are thoughtful. It's this on the margin, what makes you a manager is just really hard to define these days.
And you have to be flexible and listen, because ultimately all this stuff is to build structures and frameworks to help support achievement of business goals, right? Like, I think you can get into this kind of policing or this building of complexity in some of these projects that's not really aligned to business need. And then you end up in a cleanup exercise down the road. Again, job security.
I call it comp speak. We do way too much comp speak.
We do.
Right?
We do.
We've got to
Over-engineer
clarify
things
things for employees and managers and what all this stuff means.
Yep.
Wow, is there someone else on the call?
There's some background noise.
Well, is that a good spot to end on?
I wish we had a live
may
audience to get some feedback. I think, one of the other things I do see fairly frequently is HR comp people wanting to do this work, recognizing a need for it, but there's a gap between what they recognize as a need and their ability to influence senior leaders to fund and provide resources to do a project like this. So if there's anything missing, I think in our dialogue so far, it's like, how do you build the business case for one of these projects, right? I'd love to hear from the panel on that.
I'm a big believer of jumping on the bandwagon of other business transformational events that are triggers for it. So it's less viewed as HR's asking for this and more just normal course of implementing a new ERP system. You happen to also be doing the HCM side of things, or there's an M&A activity and you realize you haven't actually harmonized jobs of the last 15 acquisitions, but this one's big enough. Let's do it right this time. Clean up our job architecture first. Maybe we're thinking about going public and we don't want to, get sued with pay equity or pay transparency and have that all over the news as part of us ringing the bell the first week. Let's avoid that. So I'm a big believer that every business is hitting different key milestones and transformational events consistently. It's just thinking strategically around how does job architecture layer into that to help, to your point, build a business case to get you what you need without it seeming like an HR budget, handout. It's more of, you're driving the business this way. We want to help support you do that, and we have to do this for that.
Love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anybody else have any secrets to how you get these projects funded and blessed to move forward?
Sherry gives them ice cream, and they all smile.
Ice cream for everybody, all around.
With sprinkles and caramel sauce.
I agree with Bobby. Like it only becomes interesting when there's a problem to be solved, unfortunately, because the best time to do it is before the problems occur. Yeah. You can probably solve some turnover and pay equity issues and things before they actually happen. But in reality, no one really pays attention until there's a problem there. So it's like pay equity, people leaving, people complaining about lack of career paths, other business transformational projects that are going on. Those are great springboards for doing job architecture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great foundational question. What problems will it solve?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, we are at the top of the hour. Again, thank you guys so much for joining. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We'll make sure we get this posted here in just a couple of minutes. And so I think we should see it live, a live recording on LinkedIn here in a few minutes. But again, great conversation. I think that this will be one that's really well received and lots of good feedback from everybody. So again, with the Pay Practitioners panel, thank you very much, Cassandra, James, Denise, Paul, Bobby, and Sherry. We will be looking forward to catching up